Shots Energy Research Center. The speaker series is supported by Dr. Ken Ayub, our college dean, College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Science, as well as from the MSF fees that our students pay. So thanks very much for that support. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Renée Byrd this evening. This is our last presentation in this semester's Sustainable Future Speaker Series. Dr. Byrd is a member of the Environment Community Graduate Faculty, as well as a professor in the Department of Sociology. Dr. Byrd is an activist scholar, educator, and community organizer, committed to building counter-carceral knowledges in pursuit of a world without prisons. Her academic research centers the intersection of race, gender, mass imprisonment, and prison abolitionist movement building. Her more than 20 grants, fellowships, and awards include an Amnesty International Patrick Stewart Human Rights Scholarship, the Sociologist for Women in Society Chow Green Dissertation Scholarship, and the University of Washington's Graduate Medal. Her current book project is a critique of contemporary prison reforms that leave intact the logics of enslavement at the heart of the global prison industrial complex. Her article, Punishment's Twin, Theorizing Prisoner Reentry for Politics of Abolition, is forthcoming in the journal Social Justice. And the manuscript titled Prison Treated Me Way Better Than You, Reentry, Perplexity, and Naturalization of Mass Imprisonment, is currently under review by Abolition, a journal of insurgent politics. A brief sampling of some of her other many conference presentation titles give you a sense of the breadth and scope of her work. Here's a few recent conference presentation titles: Theorizing the Racial State, Black Street-Based Sex Workers and Police Violence, Consuming Punishment, Palatability, Penal Spectatorship in Orange is the New Black, and Transformative Media, Using Film Video for Community Organizing. Dr. Byrd is also currently working on an experimental film about transformative justice and methods for addressing violence without relying on policing and prisons. Dr. Byrd received her PhD from the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. Outside of academia, Renée has worked as a legal advocate for women prisoners with Justice Now in Oakland, a family advocate for youth in the juvenile justice system, and on broader campaign work aimed at building genuine human security. In collaboration with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Renée has helped produce the human rights documentary System Failure, Violence, Abuse, and Neglect in the California Youth Authority, which is currently distributed by the human rights and justice video nonprofit Witness NYC. Central to her work is the goal of using research and filmmaking not just as methods, but also as tools for building community and social movements. I'd like to end by sharing a passage from her blog. Understanding the persistence of, quote, the vestiges of slavery, unquote, is central to combating mass imprisonment contemporarily. We have to learn to think differently, outside Western frames of time and individualism, in order to develop an abolitionist imaginary, capable of untying the logics of enslavement, which persist in the present. The title of Renée's presentation this evening is Punishment's Twin, Carceral Logics, Abolitionist Critique, and the Limits of Reform. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Renée Byrd.
Thank you so much. You're welcome. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. I know this is a really, really hectic week for all of us, and so I really appreciate you making the time in your schedule to come. And I want to thank Mark Baker for that really warm introduction and for inviting me to participate in this really amazing speaker series. I'm excited to share my work with you all tonight and also hopefully to get some kind of feedback too, right? Because sometimes when you're writing alone, you can kind of go down a variety of rabbit holes and you're not really sure until you share it with other people, what's shaking out of it. And so I'm also excited to get your feedback on the project that I've been working on that I'm going to tell you about tonight. So my academic research centers race, gender, and sexuality, an analysis of prisons, and also prison abolitionist movement building. And I use critical theory, activist research, filmmaking, and other methods, and I think Mark kind of mentioned this, but to build what I call counter-carceral knowledges, to build a world without prisons. And so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about my current book project, titled Punishment's Twin, Carceral Logics, Abolitionist Critique, and the Limits of Reform. My current project interrogates mainstream justice reforms and the reform discourses surrounding them that have emerged primarily over the last 10 to 15 years. And to put it simply, I argue for a more profound transformation of our criminal punishment system. So I'd like to begin with a quote or a statement by Cassandra Shaler, who co-founded Justice Now in Oakland, California, and who taught me a lot about mass imprisonment, about abolitionist politics, and really importantly, she taught me a lot about the centrality of reform to prison expansion. In Not Light But Fire, Gender, Violence, and Strategies for Prison Abolition, Shaler writes, though we can trace a pattern in prison history of the pendulum swinging from a professed focus on punishment to a commitment to so-called reform every 30 years or so, reform still always risks becoming punishment's twin. So following Foucault's intervention in his kind of classic text Discipline and Punish, Shaler suggests that reform is in a mutually constitutive relationship with punishment, right? That reform is actually internal to the prison itself. Those of you that are my students have heard this word constitution a lot, where I'm always like, this constitutes that and constitutes this. So that should sound familiar for some of you. But she's saying, right, that reform and the prison are actually kind of locked in this relationship and that they depend on one another, right, for their existence. So my book project takes up this notion of reform as punishment's twin and pursues this idea in an analysis of contemporary discourses around the prison. During the last 10 years, critique of mass imprisonment has become much more mainstream, or significantly more mainstream. And I think that's in part due to prison abolitionist movements like Black Lives Matter, right? When I first began doing this work about 15 years ago, working with Justice Now, I think people thought I was being kind of hyperbolic when I said things like the criminal punishment system, works to support white supremacy, right? I always got these kind of smiles like, oh, that's so cute. She's so young and, radical, but one day she'll get some sense, right, and won't believe these things anymore. But I think we're in a really unique moment where the idea that the criminal justice system is bound up with racism is something that people can hear in a very different way now, right? Yeah? Okay. I still even remember my first year in grad school being told that arguments like that were kind of simplistic or they were like lacking in theoretical sophistication. And I think we've really entered a different moment, right, where those kinds of critiques can be heard. And so today that claim, right, that the punishment system works to uphold white supremacy, but also to uphold heteronormativity, gendered relations of ruling, right, and class exploitation can really be heard. 2015 witnessed the U.S. president visiting a federal prison for the first time. We saw new legislation. I guess it's 2016 now, so I should probably revise this. But we saw new legislation really aimed at reducing penalties and sentences for drugs and a variety of other types of crimes. And we also saw much more widespread media coverage of the racial disparities of the criminal justice system. Right? Yeah. So for many in the mainstream media and in academia, these developments kind of signal this profound shift in our kind of punitive orientation toward crime, right? Many people, and you see this in the news, you see this in academic discourses, but many people are heralding this as a moment that's kind of the end of the mass imprisonment era, right? And so I argue, however, that the shifting discourses surrounding crime and punishment in the contemporary moment signal both opportunity and danger. In my book project, I insist that it's vital that we unpack the constitutive imaginings that rendered mass imprisonment legible or a legible project from the outset, right? So I'm kind of raising flags of caution, I guess. So I want to back up a little bit and say something about mass imprisonment in general, and then I'll move into kind of charting the contours of my critique of contemporary reform discourses. Yeah? We're all there? I'm sure many of you are aware, right? The U.S. leads the world in imprisonment, incarcerating about 25% of the world's prisoners, while constituting about 5% of the world population, right? Counting only adults. These numbers are a bit old, but this summer I'll get new ones. Counting only adults, approximately 1 in every 100 Americans is in prison. If we look at what's called the correctional population, which includes those in prisons and jails, but also those on probation and parole under some form of criminal justice supervision, that number is 7.2 million people, or it was in 2009. It's roughly similar right now. So that's 1 in 32 adults. And this massive project of imprisonment, right, is a really new phenomenon, an unparalleled phenomenon in human history. In 1980, we imprisoned about 500,000 people in jails and prisons, and now that number, right, has quadrupled. We have about 2.3 million people in prisons and jails. And those numbers don't count people in immigration detention centers, which I would argue are prisons despite arguments to the contrary. And those numbers also don't include folks that are in our military prisons throughout the world. So this kind of ballooning of the U.S. prison population over the last 40 years is bound up with a number of other shifts, right? Shifts in how we think about the state, shifts in capitalism, and shifts in racial formation. And so I think it's important to note that the emergence of what we call mass imprisonment, right, has taken place within a very important geopolitical context. First, the global north, right, what we used to talk about as like the first world, right, has witnessed a profound process of deindustrialization, right, where manufacturing jobs that used to be the kind of foundation for the working classes have moved to the global south, right, and that's really devastated working class communities and communities of color. We know that there aren't really jobs for the 2.3 million people that we have in prisons, right? A neoliberal political rationality has come to dominate the social realm, and what I mean by that is, Wendy Brown talks about this as like all of our actions being measured in this kind of cost-benefit way, right? That the arguments that are most persuasive and legible now are ones based on cost, right? So if we want to develop a campaign around the death penalty, the most persuasive argument is one about cost rather than some other kind of like moral or ethical argument about the state putting people to death, right? And so there's this way in which business ways of thinking, right, have come to be the dominant ways that we think about everything. You see, I'm sure we see that here at HSU in our educations, right? The business of higher education is a phrase I hear a lot, and I'm like, ooh. Right, that kind of thing. And also that the state has undergone a kind of profound transformation, right? For a long time, people were saying that the state was like dying or withering away, right? Or the state was being kind of weakened in relation to transnational and multinational corporations, right? And I think that what we can see when we look at prisons is that that isn't really the case, but that the state's job has kind of changed, right? Or the way we think about the state's job, right? That the state's job is increasingly seen as kind of creating the conditions for capital accumulation, you know, and prisons and policing being really central to that. But the idea of the state having some obligation to provide a social safety net is kind of no longer persuasive. Does that make sense? So like the state's job or how we think about it has kind of changed. So the prison has been a really, hopefully that's large enough and you all can see it. Yeah? I need like a call and response thing. Our heads. Okay, so the prison has been a really central site for the management of social and economic insecurities that are rooted in these processes, that are rooted in processes of globalization, and rooted in longer histories of colonial rule, heteronormativity, and racial apartheid. So mass imprisonment is less the result of an actual increase in crime and more about a shift toward what Loic Foucault calls the penalization of poverty, right, or the punishment of poverty. And so the question, you know, for me is, how is it that mass imprisonment has become so radically naturalized that, to quote Angela Davis, it is as if prison were an inevitable fact of life like birth and death, right? So my work is really concerned with unpacking the logics behind this naturalization of mass imprisonment and unearthing the kind of common sense discourses and processes through which the prison has been rendered palatable. right? So this prison building boom happened, and we really didn't have a kind of, broad debate about whether this was the strategy we wanted to use, right? As a solution to drug addiction or a whole host of other issues, right? It just kind of happened, right? And it seems really natural, right? I mean, I don't know how many times we hear, right? Well, that's just kind of what you do, right? You do the crime, you do the time, right? It's kind of, I don't know, it's profoundly naturalized. And so I'm interested in how that kind of happened. When 40 years ago, there were even mainstream criminologists saying that the prison was going to die away, that it clearly didn't work, right? So on and so forth. And so how is it then that this was achieved, right? That it just seems so normal to us. And so I think that it's important to understand the centrality of the prison to maintaining systems of power, right? And the ways in which those systems distribute life chances, right? And render some bodies and some lives disposable in the world that we live in. The contemporary prison and white supremacy are bound up with one another in ways that still, I think, are kind of under-theorized, or that we still don't have the kind of complexity that we need to understand the relationship here between the prison and white supremacy, to my mind. Oh, I'm behind. Sorry, guys. So as Mary Bosworth says, the prison is indeed a social, race is indeed a social construct. It is dependent in part upon the prison, while the prison relies on it as well, right? And so she's really saying there's this kind of mutually constitutive relationship, right, between the prison and race. And I think that it's really important that we, bring some kind of real complex analytic skills to thinking about what that relationship is, right? It's not simple. Imprisonment in the U.S. functions to explain and manage racial dynamics, reproducing inequalities rooted in longer histories. At the same time, mass imprisonment, and I'll explain what I mean by this a little bit, but mass imprisonment is productive of new configurations of racial signification and new assemblages of racialized criminality. Okay? So criminality and race have been kind of stuck together for a long time in U.S. history. In his address to the people of the United States, delivered in 1883, Frederick Douglass notes that white supremacy tends to, quote, impute crime to color, all right? Cesar Lombroso's 19th century criminal types show the emergent classificatory system central to the very idea of race. He argued that one was born a criminal and that criminal types shared certain physical and psychological abnormalities. While he focused primarily on European criminals, he argued that that these shared kind of abnormalities could be seen also in animals and so-called primitive peoples, right? Thereby kind of linking this idea of the criminality, animality, and the racialized other, right? And so really from the birth of even the discipline of criminology, right, we see ideas about criminality and the kind of emergent ideas about race and scientific racism kind of happening in parallel, okay? Should I slow down? Okay, so prisons are what Loic Foucault calls race-making institutions, okay? He identifies slavery, Jim Crow, the ghetto, and finally the prison as a kind of linked set of developments. And he says not one, but several peculiar institutions have successively operated to define, confine, and control African Americans in the history of the United States, end quote. So importantly for him, these are race-making institutions. And this is a bear of a quote, but I couldn't help but share it with you. He says, they do not simply process an ethno-racial division that would somehow exist outside of and independent of them. Each produces or co-produces this division anew out of inherited demarcations and disparities of group power and inscribes it at every epoch in a distinctive constellation of material and symbolic forms, end quote. Right? So this idea that the prison both relies on kind of our older notions around racialized criminality, but then also kind of produces new ones too, right? So an analysis of the prison, I think really must demonstrate an understanding of how white supremacy buttresses, but is also buttressed by gendered relations of ruling, ableism, the policing of sexuality, right? A whole host of regimes of normativity that are central to the operation of power today. And so we need an analysis of how prison and race are kind of stuck together in this way, but we also have to have a really robust notion of race that's intersectional, right? That sees how race has always been about sexuality, right? I mean, from the beginning, and gender and so on and so forth. We can see this early in prisons. Prisons were central to kind of gendered notions around the body. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's account of prison life in the 1950s, it's called The Alderson Story, and she shows how in that facility a woman's rehabilitation was really premised on practicing or being able to demonstrate particular kinds of notions of femininity, right? And particular kinds of like correct womanly behaviors, right? And so the notions of rehabilitation, even before our kind of punitive turn, right, were really steeped in these systems and getting people to conform to them, right? Ideologies of, so prisons are kind of deeply structured by gendered relations, and those relations reflect what we see on the outside world, right? But they also kind of the prison also kind of further entrenches the gendered relations of ruling on the outside. Ideologies of racialized sexuality, right, are really central here as well, to the kind of ways that women of color get criminalized, how trans folks get criminalized. Across the board, we really need to have an intersectional perspective. And so I think that an analysis of imprisonment and the kind of role of criminalization in systems of power is really important right now because there's so many ways that we are encouraged to accept kind of Band-Aid approaches or Band-Aid solutions rather than calling for deeper transformation, right? To accept body cameras rather than alternatives to the police, or prisoner reentry programs rather than fewer people kidnapped from our communities in the first place. Oh, Lord, that's a long quote. Bear with me. So I had to share you this quote as well. I have, a thing for quotes. If you've been in my classes, you know this. But I wanted to share this in an article titled Queering Prison Abolition Now. Eric Stanley and Dean Spade write this. They say, there is nothing new about police enforcing racialized gender norms with deadly violence. But as criminalization and imprisonment have drastically expanded in the last decades, we have needed to respond in new ways to calls for law and order that sometimes pretend to operate from a concern for protecting women, queer, and trans people from violence. We are confronted with a significant task of articulating a politics that refuses invitations to be included in laws and policies that supposedly promote the value of our lives, but actually operate to expand systems that we know target queer and trans poor people, people of color, immigrants, and people with disabilities, end quote. So Stanley and Spade point to something really significant here about the way that a politics of recognition imperils efforts to transform our lives and the violence endemic to the U.S. racial state. They insist on, quote, a politics that refuses invitations to be included. And I think this is incredibly important as we move into a time where mass imprisonment is being questioned on such a broad level, that increasingly reform of our criminal justice system is articulated in such a way that it actually shores up the logics at the heart of these very processes. And I'll give you some examples and explain what I mean by that. I'm going to let us take a breath. I'm going to get my water. Yeah? Okay. And then we'll keep going. Okay. Giant quotes. Can we read that? Try to not pour water down the front of me. That's totally what would happen, right? Okay, so in my project, Punishment's Twin, I'm developing a critique of the ways that current prison reform efforts, rather than transforming the system, actually extend the types of state violence that it seems like they're addressing, okay? That mainstream articulations of prisoner reentry, for example, leave intact the logics of white supremacy at the heart of mass imprisonment. So I focus on prisoner reentry initiatives, new sentencing legislation, and then also depictions of prisons in popular culture to illuminate penal reform in the contemporary moment. And also, well, the election is increasingly throwing fodder my way, as I think one of my students told me the other day that Hillary Clinton used the term over mass incarceration, which I was like, exactly. Like there's a right amount of mass incarceration, right? We've just gone over. You know, I'm like, wait a minute, let's think through this. So I argue that mainstream justice reforms represent the latest installment in a long history of reforms which have tended to bolster the penal system, and that these reforms are operating in the contemporary moment to bolster the system, even as they're deployed using language that is kind of co-opted language, right? That language that they're kind of co-opting the language of prison activists that prison activists have been using all along, right? That we kind of need to be wary of that. So there are a number of lines along which this critique is kind of playing out in the book. In one chapter I examine, this is not like the sexiest way to discuss this, but I haven't found a better phrase yet, the discursive production of a violent, non-violent offender binary in discourses around reduced sentencing legislation. So I'm looking at Prop 47, and I've created a kind of, with the help of Hannah, my graduate research assistant, wave Hannah. I'm embarrassing her. I'm so mean. Okay, so she's been helping me. We have kind of created this archive of news coverage of Prop 47 and 150 different news articles about somewhere in there. And so Prop 47 was a referendum that passed last academic year on November 4th, 2014. It was referred to as the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Act, and it resulted in the reduction of penalties for some people who were convicted of nonviolent and non-serious property and drug crimes. Importantly, it also allows some people who have previously been convicted of eligible crimes to apply to have, to apply for reduced sentences or to have their felonies changed to misdemeanors, right? Which is great. A significant aspect of the proposition and discussions around it have been around this kind of neoliberal trope. Remember neoliberal, right? That was market logics. Of cost effectiveness, okay? So obviously, incarcerating fewer people is going to save the state money, right? And the proposition requires that those savings be distributed in this way, okay? So on the surface, this looks really, really good, right? If you are a kind of progressive person who's been living in California the last few years, hearing people chant education, not incarceration, this looks like that, or at least like it's kind of moving in that direction, right? Prison money being funneled to the Department of Education, at least 25% of it, right? The popular discourse was often that it was all going to go to schools, right? And so if you really look at the numbers, okay, 25% is going to education, okay? But also, and this is still playing out, so how it's implemented is still a question. But significantly, there was a lot of discussion that actually what was required for that 25% was for it to go to funding truancy prevention, right? So I was like, that's interesting. Not books or teachers, right? Truancy prevention. So this really motivated me to kind of take a closer look. And in beginning a kind of critical discourse analysis of this news coverage, over and over again, what emerged was this kind of constant articulation that nonviolent offenders, you needed to be diverted from incarceration, right, in order to save money, while at the same time reaffirming that violent offenders, though, require imprisonment, right? So so Darrell Steinberg, who's the Democratic president pro tem of the California State Senate, and who was a large proponent of 47, said this. He said, people overwhelmingly say that we need to distinguish between violent criminals who belong in prison and those who could serve their sentences in a much more cost-effective way for the taxpayers. So I argue that the deployment of a violent, non-violent offender binary is a kind of crucial discursive tactic for shoring up the palatability of the prison precisely in the moment when the criminal punishment system's kind of imbrication with white supremacy has finally come into crisis, right? Okay, I'll explain what I mean by this. Yes. So the figure of the non-violent offender, where am I? The figure of the non-violent offender is a relational figure, mutually constituted with the violent offender. When one makes normative statements about how non-violent offenders should be treated or supervised in the community, one necessarily then invokes the figure of the violent offender, who then implicitly belongs in prison and is deserving of the violence of imprisonment. The prison is a site that's really constituted by violence, and I'll talk a little bit about that. There's an everydayness of violence within the prison that, as Cassandra Shaler writes, quote, consistently operates on several registers at once, end quote. In prison, people often live with very little space, have little to no privacy, and often struggle to purchase hygiene products and cleaning supplies. Given that prisons are often sited in rural areas, while imprisoned people are often from urban areas, family and friends may struggle to travel the distance needed to visit them regularly. It's not uncommon for a prisoner to struggle with maintaining contact with their children, and parental rights are often terminated during imprisonment, particularly for people who are the kind of primary caregiver for a child prior to going into the prison, and depending on the age of their kid, like if their kid's really young, they're like pushing, anyway, that's, okay, rabbit holes. Solitary confinement, it has been shown to produce significant harm to prisoners, while generally considered, or well, I don't know, by some people, by some experts, a kind of emergency measure that should be ended within 48 hours. Many prisoners in the U.S. live in solitary confinement for months and years on end. And this has shown that no matter the kind of mental health status of the person going in, right, that this is really detrimental to people's mental health being in solitary confinement that long. So the prison is a space constituted by violence, right? Strip searches are a routine kind of procedure in prisons. Most prisons require that an imprisoned person be strip searched upon visiting family or an attorney. When I used to work as a legal advocate for Justice Now, I worked with a lot of women with histories of sexual abuse who always talked about how that was like this re-traumatizing thing, right? That like there had been maybe a long line of abusers, but the prison was just the kind of like the latest one. And that's always kind of haunted me, right? That like in order to visit your kids, right, you're going to have to be strip searched. And so like, what is that doing? So medical abuse and neglect are also rampant in U.S. prisons. And this is a kind of, I think, additional site where we can really see the kind of inherent violence of the prison. Cynthia Chandler, who is the other co-founder of Justice Now and who also taught me a lot, so indebted to her here and everything that I know, basically. But she's written about how there's this kind of fundamental incompatibility between punishment and the provision of medical care, right? And this is definitely something I saw at Justice Now, right, where concerns over cost effectiveness and the provision of care and the kind of ethos of punishment just really, I mean, they don't go together almost fundamentally. So medical services are also being kind of contracted out a lot to private corporations to save money, and this has resulted in a lot of instances where the kind of medical concerns of imprisoned people are ignored with devastating results. In November 2012, reports surfaced about Eric Thomas, a prisoner in a prison in Minnesota Correctional Facility, Stillwater, and two nurses employed by the private company Horizon, Inc., ignored the fact that he was writhing in pain in his cell, reportedly writing the word faker in their shift report. And that was something I saw a lot at Justice Now, this idea that like, oh, well, they're just trying to get pain medication, right? And that discourse then means that even women that I was working with who were dying, right, couldn't get pain medication. And I thought, like, if you're dying, it doesn't matter if you're an addict, right? At that point, I mean, if you want pain medication, anyway, I'm just going off, aren't I? Okay, so anyway, hours later, right, Thomas is finally rushed to the hospital despite not being believed for a long time, and doctors found a blood clot pressing on the nerves of top his spine, right? And so after surgery, he basically had to learn to walk all over again, right? And so this is another, I think, area, the provision of medical care, where you can see the kind of inherent violence of the prison, right? I think there's kind of a fundamental kind of contradiction between the provision of care of heal. I don't know if the purpose of medical care is supposed to be healing, but if it is, right, that and punishment don't go well together. And so the prison is not only kind of physically and I think emotionally violent, but I would also argue that it's kind of symbolically violent, that it exercises a kind of symbolic violence that impacts entire communities, particularly communities of color, that the way in which criminality gets inscribed on the bodies of people of color strikes at the heart of our conceptions of ourselves and the ability to imagine oneself and one's community differently. And so an abolitionist critique really shows how the prison itself is a form of violence. Okay? So returning to the arguments of the book, if some offenders, usually figured as nonviolent, occasional drug users, right, are said to not belong in prison, then that figure is constructed in opposition to an imprisoned person who's framed as deserving of excessive punishment and torture. So I'm not saying that Prop 47 isn't doing some good. It certainly is. I'm very, very happy to see some people getting out. But I think that we have to ask, about the ramifications or the costs of our kind of rhetorical and discursive choices, right, around the reforms like this. Framing contemporary prison reforms around a violent, nonviolent offender binary comes at enormous costs. We have to ask, what are the outcomes when the state then operationalizes this binary and makes decisions based on this way of categorizing people? As we know, categorization is a really powerful strategy, right? And it does particular kinds of work in the world. As Pierre Bourdieu recognizes, quote, the act of categorization, when it manages to achieve recognition or when it is exercised by a recognized authority, exercises by itself a certain kind of power, end quote. Scholars using critical discourse analysis have done an enormous amount of work to show how categorization operates within discourse and within language, right? And it's never simply about a distinction between groups, right? It, quote, is normally done to accomplish something other than just categorizing, end quote. So I think it's vital to pay close attention to the work that categorization within these discourses of prison reform, what it's doing. With the violent, nonviolent offender binary, reform movements reposition the lines between those inside and outside, between the realm of legitimate, innocent citizenship and those cast out of the polity, who are deemed then deserving of torture. As Andrew Dilts writes, quote, the boundaries of political membership are actively produced and reproduced through the practice of punishment, end quote. So, yeah. I don't know. I mean, violent, nonviolent offender binary. It sounds kind of boring, but it's not. So the nonviolent, violent offender binary is doing this kind of important exclusionary work, in my estimation, today. And I think we have to question how this distinction will be made. We already know that perceptions of being capable of violence are profoundly racialized. And so I think that to be sure that we can make this distinction and that it won't perpetuate oppression, I think is just very naive, right? That maintaining a binary between violent and nonviolent prisoners closes down rather than opens up possibilities for liberatory political struggle against mass imprisonment. Okay, so in another chapter, I'm just kind of giving you an overview through things. So in another chapter, I examine mainstream kind of prisoner reentry initiatives. And I approach prisoner reentry as a kind of discursive formation, because I'm a post-structuralist, and I'm sure that's annoying, but that's kind of how I'm approaching it. Of course, people have exited prisons for, since the beginning of prisons, right? But it's really in the last 15 years that prisoner reentry has been this kind of buzzword, and has been this kind of trend in corrections. And so I'm interested in its life in that way. So I argue that the immediate survival needs of our communities, right, make changes to the criminal justice system really, really urgent, right? However, a kind of uncritical acceptance of the kind of seemingly benign notions of prisoner reentry that circulate in the world, I think warrants caution. So I look at a number of aspects of reentry and how it's articulated, particularly discourses around cost effectiveness. It's often been held out as this way of saving the state money. And you also kind of heard that echoed in the Prop 47 quotes, right? And I also look at the adoption of medicalized language. There's a big focus on what people are talking about as dosage, right? That you have to get the kind of correct, there was a judge in, I think, Texas who was saying, like, you have to get the right dosage, that you have to fill up, like, 70% of the offender's time so that they can be, and this notion of dosage, which is like how many services you provide or how much intervention you provide, is really interesting to me, right? That you're adopting this kind of medical language. And I think that what that does is actually situate reentry then as this process that needs to happen on like the individual level about people's time management skills rather than a kind of broader cause for kind of systematic change, right? That rather than questioning why we've locked up so many people, we're like, well, if we just offer them services afterwards. And of course, I mean, I think as communities, we have to come together around people getting out and support them, but I think we also have to question the way that reentry is posited as this like individual thing, as if like the issue with mass incarceration is within the soul of the offender, right? Versus like broader structures that we all live in. So the other aspect of the critique I develop of reentry, I'm just going over three. I mean, I have a lot of critique there. But a key feature also is the way that the criminal justice system is looked to as the solution, right? Reentry reforms tend to look to the criminal punishment system as a solution to social problems that it itself is a big part of sustaining and perpetuating, right? Advocates of reentry continue to kind of naively believe that prisons can be made into spaces of transformation, right? Rather than recognizing the kind of inherent violence of imprisonment. So Jeremy Travis, who is really one of the kind of founders of what he calls the reentry movement, he and Janet Reno were kind of the first to be like, oh, maybe we should do something about this, and then it kind of took off a bit later. But he, in much of his work, has kind of articulated this vision where prison time is like an accomplishment, and families are included in the process, and society like ritually recognizes the hard work of prisoners in repaying their debt. And this is a passage from his work. He says, when released, John would be brought back to court, perhaps the same court where he was sentenced. A public recognition ceremony would be held before an audience of family and other members of the support team, and the judge would announce that John had completed a milestone in repaying his debt to society. So whatever warm feelings this vision of a public recognition ceremony may evoke, ultimately, I argue that this reform vision repackages and renders palatable state violence. That imprisonment has enormous impacts on families and communities, and while maintaining family ties, right, is often a worthy goal, that we need to ask really serious questions about the wisdom of positing family inclusion in the criminal justice system as the most radical thing that we can imagine here, right? That often these reforms then simply leave families more entrenched in the criminal punishment system without recognizing the violence, right, of tearing families and communities apart. In his book, But They All Come Back, Facing the Challenges of Prisoner Reentry, Travis writes that accepting released offenders into the community without a period of supervised release is morally unsatisfying. They have not yet earned their place at our table. And so this idea that they have not earned their place at our table is, I think, really indicative of the work that reentry is actually doing contemporarily in terms of managing populations, right? That it's actually about expanding the surveillance of the criminal justice system and making the prison more flexible and malleable than genuinely transforming the conditions that led to mass incarceration in the first place. I'm going off script, so I should be careful. I think that it's indicative, this quote, of the kinds of exclusionary logics which constitute the carceral state more generally, and raises the question of prisoners' relationships to our table, right, from the outset, right, prior to the offense that supposedly justifies their social abandonment in the prison. And so essentially this idea of unsupervised release as kind of morally problematic, I think opens up a space for increasing the surveillance capacities of the penal system. And I think that framing reentry in this way then forecloses the possibility of asking much more radical questions about the uses of locking people away in the first place, right? So there are those chapters. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but I also have a chapter where I'm looking at representations of the prison in popular culture, and I'm looking at Orange is the New Black. I know, where I argue that the representation of the prison is changing, and the ways that viewers are encouraged to participate vicariously in punishment through culture is changing in ways that kind of reflect a move towards shoring up the prison's palatability. That was a really horrible way of describing that. But I'm not going to say a lot about that right now because Orange is the New Black tends to like take over the Q&A, and let's stay focused on the whole book right now before we get too excited. As we find ourselves in a moment where mass imprisonment is finally being questioned, I think we really have to understand the centrality of reform to the prison historically, right? And that the very founding of the prison was itself a reform, right? And so Foucault articulates this in Discipline and Punish very well. He writes that one should also recall that the movement for reforming the prisons, for controlling their functioning, is not a recent phenomenon. It does not even seem to have originated in a recognition of failure. Prison reform is virtually contemporary with the prison itself. It constitutes, as it were, its program. So Foucault locates reform, in the heart of the prison, right? The modern prison was itself a product of reform, right? After the American Revolution, reformers sought to kind of get rid of the kind of ghastly spectacles of capital and corporal punishment that were inherited from England, and the prison was thought to be this kind of humane reform. Immediately after the prison emerged, reformers voiced concerns about conditions of confinement. Advocates for women in prison, were saying, highlighting all of the abuses that women were facing, because originally there weren't co-ed prisons, right? And so then we had women's prisons being built. While reform is often genuinely, fought for to alleviate the suffering of prisoners, I think what we see is that often reforms better serve those who design and administer the reforms rather than the people they're seeking to help. That reform movements often discursively kind of position themselves as outside the prison, but history shows that they're actually internal to the prison and help the prison to expand and grow, right? And we end up with bigger, better prisons, right? So contemporary prison reforms have often led to the building of bigger, better prisons as opposed to a more kind of fundamental transformation of the underlying dynamics, right, of state violence. And so the history of prison reform, this is Shaler and Chandler again, reveals that mere reform fails to address the inequalities, oppression, and state violence upon which the institution of the prison is built, leaving the violent foundation intact and rendering ineffective attempts to relieve the suffering of oppressed people confined within it. And so the complaints of reformers then about prison conditions are often used to legitimate building more prisons. Criticisms about abuses within prisons, the distance between prisons and prisoners' families, the kind of violence of prison health care, right? Those have all been used as justifications to actually expand the system. A really good example of this, with Justice Now, when I was working with them, right? The kind of health, a lot of us have probably heard about the medical abuses and the medical neglect in California prisons, right? They're the kind of source of a lot of the changes that are happening. For a long time, people with Justice Now were kind of fighting against those abuses and trying to get women who were dying inside out of prison. And one of the solutions that the Department of Corrections came up with was to decide to build a new wing in the prison where the dying prisoners would go, and we ended up with a skilled nursing facility, right? And so you have even prisoners. I once had a client that was in, should I tell about this? I don't know. Who was in like a vegetative state and was like, okay, this person could get out, right? It's way more expensive to keep this person in a prison. They're obviously not a threat to society, right? But like the solution so often becomes reforming the prison or building a bigger prison or a new wing or getting more high-tech technology, right? Or something to make the prison bigger and better. And that becomes the solution to the things we complain about. So I think we have to be very, very careful about that. So I think we have to incorporate this critique of reform in our strategies for combating mass imprisonment contemporarily, that we can more carefully craft strategies that help alleviate prisoners' suffering right now, while also, engaging in what, I'll talk about what this means, but in non-reformist reforms that diminish the power of the system, okay? So Andre Gortz, and this is another term that's like, really? Non-reformist reform? Like, not the sexiest term you could have come up with. but it works. He was the first to kind of define this term. He was an old Marxist theorist, and he defines the difference between, another giant quote, he talks about the difference between reformist reforms and non-reformist reforms in this way. I know, it's just giant, but we have to go to the original source, don't we? He says a reformist reform is one which subordinates its objectives to the criteria of rationality and practicability of a given system or policy. Reformism rejects those objectives and demands, however deep the need for them, which are incompatible with the preservation of the system. On the other hand, a not necessarily reformist reform is one which is conceived not in terms of what is possible within the framework of a given system of administration, but in view of what should be made possible in terms of human needs and demands. A non-reformist reform is determined not in terms of what can be, but what should be. Right? So obviously we're going to need some reforms here, but it's about what kinds of reforms are we talking about. The moment when an oppressive system begins to articulate its own failure and need for reform is precisely the moment that I think critical intellectuals must remain keen to how the logics of domination get kind of repackaged and repurposed over and over again, right? I mean, a lot of you students that are in college, right, don't you feel this when you're in your class and you're like, oh, history just keeps kind of repeating itself. How do we keep ending up in the same stuff? That's what my students say a lot, yeah? Well, so I think we have to be kind of attentive to that, even as we're hopeful in this moment that certain changes are going to happen, that we need reforms on the road to abolition, but ultimately we must kind of critically interrogate the potential for some reforms to bolster the very logics that produce violence in the first place. Okay, so I'm almost done. So as I've said, my project is about kind of unearthing the logics that made mass imprisonment a kind of legible possibility in the first place, and then showing how these contemporary reforms rearticulate those logics implicitly. And so I'm still figuring out how to talk about this whole carceral logics piece. Some scholars have thought about imprisonment in terms of like a logic of social death, right? Drawing on Orlando Patterson's work on slavery as social death. And I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to figure this all out this summer. But I'm beginning with the kind of logics of white supremacy that are theorized by Andy Smith, and kind of reworking them in a more intersectional way to talk about the logics at the heart of criminalization. So Andy Smith charts 3 logics at the heart of white supremacy. The logic of enslavement, which he argues renders Black people as inherently enslavable and as property. And I think that this is kind of similar to a prison activist scholar, Dylan Rodriguez, his notion of a kind of chattel logic that he says is at the heart of the U.S. prison, where prisoners are, quote, conceived as the fungible property of the state, end quote. And I think we can see this kind of logic of enslavement in the 1871, this very famous case, Ruffin v. Commonwealth, where the Virginia Supreme Court stated in its decision that prisoners were, quote, slaves of the state, who were entitled to no rights but those which the state grants in its benevolence. And so Andy Smith, for her, the logic of enslavement is kind of founded on anti-Black racism. She also theorizes the logic of genocide, which holds that indigenous people must disappear or are always seen to be disappearing. And prisons and criminalization, right, have been really central tools of colonialism. And I think that we can also see a kind of logic of genocide in the way that prisons kind of disappear large segments of our communities, right, and that seem to kind of hide folks that we imagine like represent particular kinds of social problems. And so she also then theorizes the logic of Orientalism, which is like this logic of war or permanent war. And that's a logic that she says we can kind of see in anti-immigrant sentiment or kind of anti-Arab discourses right now. And so I wonder how we might kind of take up and think about them as like logics with which rendered mass imprisonment possible. I don't know where I'm going here, but how do prisons reduce human beings to property or disappear imprisoned people or wage war on communities. And so I don't have like a neat set of like a chart of logics yet for you, but I'm in this place of kind of trying to figure out a way to articulate the logics that these reforms fail to address, if that makes sense. But also to articulate them in a way that kind of gets at the kind of flexibility and nuance needed, and also how white supremacy and gendered relations of ruling and heteronormativity, right, like all kind of are part of the logics. Does that make sense? Probably not, because I don't know if it does either. So I'm trying to kind of figure out a way to think about the logics at the heart of the system, but in a way that really shows how a variety of systems of oppression kind of find meaning in and through one another. And so to close, taking our analysis of systems of power and regimes of normalization, I think this is really vital because a politics of abolition is not just like some naive idea that's about kind of closing all the prisons and then we're going to have the world that we want, right? Prison abolition is a critical practice and liberatory vision of a world without prisons and insists on getting at the root causes, right? And highlighting the way that criminalization really hasn't produced safety in our communities. A world without prisons is also then fundamentally a world without white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, to use Bell Hook's wonderful little phrase there. It's a world where people have genuine human security, by which I mean housing and access to good food, amongst other essentials, including the integrity of our cultural and ancestral traditions. A world without prisons is a world structured around facilitating human flourishing, which is a genuinely sustainable world. So while we need to engage in a kind of politics of survival, I think right now, sometimes which means engaging in reforms so that as many of our people can survive as possible, we also have to simultaneously make sure that we are careful and critical about the ease with which relations of domination are reproduced. Thank you. That's all. So I don't think that forecloses the possibility of some kind of rupture that radically changes something, but I do think that so it's about thinking about how different reforms operate. I think that there can be reforms that aren't about shoring up, because you're getting at precisely the difference between a reformist reform and a non-reformist reform. And it's hard to think about, how you make that distinction, but how do we think about reforms or actions that we can take now that don't necessarily, that don't build up the system, but that help people survive? Does that make sense? So maybe that means, right, like people need legal services right now some of the time. People need food right now. It's a reform in some ways to just, if we decided to like cook and go out and give homeless people food, right? We're not ending homelessness with that. It's kind of a reform, right? That we're going to start this program that's going to give food. But how do you do that in such a way that it's not bolstering the system? Does that make sense? So it's like finding a way, and that's a question that has to keep being asked. That's not like I have a list of reforms and I'm like, these are the good ones, these are the bad ones, right? We have to keep asking as we develop political campaigns and proposals, what's this doing, right? And the system is really good, I think, about kind of co-opting certain reforms and making them shore up the system. And so it's kind of a continual struggle. We have to keep asking, okay, is this, propping up the system we're trying to destroy, or is this, not? Does that make sense? Because I think there is a kind of ethical imperative to help people survive now. Like people are dying in our prisons and jails right now. And I don't think we can just say, well, we're going to wait for the revolution and then we'll not have prisons, right? But how do we do this in a way that doesn't get used to just make the problem worse? And that's not an easy, there's no, I can't tell you like this is for sure good and this is bad. We have to keep asking like, what's this doing?
So when you're talking about Prop 47, you kind of had like two pretty simple questions.
Okay.
So you said it reduces penalties for something with non-violent or non-serious crimes.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if that plays into the 3 strikes law and minimum sentencing. Because if someone commits a non-violent felony, but it's still a felony, does the 3 strikes law,
So there's been that's a good question. I think you see similar discourses around the language around reforming three strikes, right? Where it was like, well, but some people are getting caught up in this that shouldn't be, right? And so I think you see that same language where, and I mean, there are moments where it's really useful to like highlight, like for a lot of people have been saying, well, okay, but there are all these people in prison who like their third strike was like stealing a stereo or something. Should someone, and that was kind of used often to persuade people that three strikes was a problem. And I think that was persuasive, but at the same time, right, what that says is that like, it still is setting up that way of thinking that like, there are some people that really should, that the three strikes really works. It's just we've over captured. Does that make sense? Like we've just gotten too many people or something. That if we kind of fine tune the metrics, it'll be okay. Right? Yeah. What was your other question? I'm sorry.
In correlation with that, when you're talking about like the cost and funding going from that towards like education, 25% towards education, 10%. What is that funding coming from? Like, are they basing it off of? Okay, we're giving this person a lesser charge, so we don't have to spend that much money, and that money is going towards it, or?
Well, some of this is still being worked out, but it's also that it's pretty expensive to incarcerate people, right? So the idea is that there will be money saved by not, I actually don't know where we're at in terms of like, I don't think anyone's proposed like closing a prison yet, so I don't know exactly how that's going to work, but theoretically, I actually don't know in terms of budgets where it's at right now in terms of, I don't know that, because also now there's all this new funding then, like some of the funding also goes to community corrections, right? So presumably then that money goes to supervising people in the community, but it's not like we know necessarily like dollar for dollar. I don't know, it's confusing. I don't know how they're calculating the amount of money saved, actually. I should look that up, but time.
Are there any examples of communities in history or presently that don't have prisons?
Mm-hmm.
And what are the largest communities or the largest social groupings that don't have prisons? I was kind of wondering at a certain numerical number that prisons start coming into existence.
So really, I mean, this seems crazy, but really the prison is a very recent phenomena, right? Like we haven't had prisons for that long, a few hundred years. Prisons are actually very young. For most of human history, we've dealt with behavior that we don't like by banishing people, torturing people, but also, I mean, there are communities where there's been more of a kind of focus on healing the community, right? And so I guess, one of the things that I look at is kind of notions of community accountability, and something that Mimi Kim says, she does a lot of work around community accountability. She started an organization called Creative Interventions, and she says that it's not about having to come up with all these new strategies, but really it's about like remembering the old ways of like how people used to deal with things. I don't have like a perfect formula for you about like how we should deal with things, but I think that there are ways to deal with violence I don't think prisons work, right? And so I don't know that I can like name a country. I mean, I don't know, like
I didn't know.
Like the Dogra tribe, Malidoma Somé, I'm sure.
Ancient Chinese, the Incas, the Maya culture. If we look at indigenous culture, I don't know what the Karuk, the Yura, the Hupa, what were their forms? Was it banishment? You went to another community? Was it you left the community and were out on your own?
So that's a great question. That's exactly the kind of question we have to ask, right? Now, there are a whole diverse array of different ways that communities have dealt with harm, right? So banishment has been one way. There's not one way that like all Native peoples, right, were dealing with harm. I think we have to be really careful about like romanticizing also certain ways of dealing with harm. But there are some texts on kind of early tribal justice systems that think about like how do you heal the community. If you only have a certain number of people, you can't just keep banishing people because you kind of need their labor too, right? And so I'm not like I don't know like all of the Inca and everyone's different ways of I don't have a good quantification of that, but I have faith there are other ways.
I saw fairly recently a Michael Moore movie that showed the prison industrial complex in the United States, comparing it to Norway, Sweden, Finland, and it showed in those countries that practiced more of a socialism democracy, very low prison treated fairly nicely. They had farms to grow vegetables. They actually enjoyed it there. It was like not a country club, but it was the only thing was loneliness. They could be with their family. And it showed the U.S. prisons were extreme violence and extreme reentries. And I'm wondering why so many other places with less money than we have do such a better job of the way people are treated than here. So I'm just wondering.
So you're hitting on a lot of really juicy things. I mean, one, I think it's about priorities. There are a couple of things. So there are other countries where their prisons are not as punitive as ours, right? We are certainly, our inability to have sympathy for imprisoned people is quite extraordinary. That said, I think we have to be really careful about like romanticizing the humanity of like prisons in Europe, because I think there's this way in which sometimes we do that and we say, well, we could just be nicer, and I'm not so sure it's actually that nice. I think that there's some evidence now that like that seems to work really well in countries when they're still relatively homogenous, but then as migrants come in, suddenly they don't want them in those prisons, they want to deal with them differently. And so I think that definitely like our punitiveness in this country is bound up with white supremacy and with like our inability. I think it's racialized, the way we are unable to see imprisoned people as human beings, right, or as someone that might be our brother or our sister or our mother or whoever. But I'm also really wary about like romanticizing the humane prison that's like got a recording studio in it, because I mean, for me, like I think we need to transform our prisons to such a degree that we wouldn't really even call them prisons anymore. And maybe them having a farm is that, I don't know, but I think we should just be careful because we keep trying to do it better and more nicely, and then it just gets bigger, you know? So, and maybe this is overly hopeful, but I do genuinely believe that if we provided the conditions for people to live lives that they found meaningful, to have access to like the basic things that one needs in terms of food and shelter, and to have like meaningful ways to contribute to their communities, right, that I think a lot of our problems would go away. I don't mean to sound like totally naive, but also like I think that, I mean, we're producing a lot of our own vulnerability here, and also the reality is that we cannot even afford, back to cost effectiveness, to keep incarcerating people at the rates that we are, so people do come back to our communities. And we have to ask, like, do we want people to come back to our communities more traumatized, or do we want to actually deal with, confront the fact that we have, like, huge problems with violence in our society? And it's not just about bad individuals. It's about, as a whole, like, we are really, I mean, I don't know. I think that sometimes imprisonment's about our failure to really, like, look ourselves in the face and ask, like, how did this happen? How is it that, like, the people that, I mean, I think this is also a big problem you see with, like, even how we confront child sexual abuse, right? That, like, we can't really see it because we imagine it's some horrible monster, and it's really, like, their soccer coach or the guy next door or some person that looks totally normal, right? And so, like, our failure to really, like, look at what we're dealing with is, I think, half the problem. Yeah. Great. Well, I'm happy to keep talking with people afterwards. Or, one more question.
You said that categorizing the unconscious maintenance of the system. Like when they start categorizing, to me, what I saw visually was they depicted a certain type of prisoner as violent, and a prisoner of color. A prisoner that just made a mistake and really didn't deserve a long time. I saw more white prisoners like that. In my imagination, or was that something that was intentionally done?
Well, that's precisely what I was kind of saying, right? Is that, like, we can't really, the idea that we can just sort out who's violent or not violent, and that's not going to end up reproducing systems of oppression is really naive, right? Because I do think it tends to be that that prisoners of color are read as being violent or hostile or needing to be in solitary, right? Where, like, yeah, it's disproportionately going to be more likely certain kinds of people, white people, that are seen as, well, they just made a mistake, right? We don't say that about people of color often, like, oh, they just made a mistake, right? We tend to go to, oh, well, that's like about their character. They have to be in solitary, or they have to be in this maximum security prison. Yeah, so I think, yeah, you're totally right. Yeah. Cool. Right on. Thank you guys so much for being here.